Perfect. All right. All right, perfect. Okay, so let's get our slides up here. All right, so today's class is on minority health and ancestral trauma. This is often a topic that is really not addressed in healthcare. We talk about some of the healthcare disparities in minority populations, but we neglect really to speak about the ancestral component of trauma. And why is that? The genetics and the Genome Project most recently just finished within the last few years. And there's still, a lot of misnomers about it. There's still a lot of reluctance to really accept that data. And then there's still really an infantile recognition and understanding in regards to epigenetics, which is the environment that we put these genes in. Now, there has been a lot of advancements in adverse childhood experiences with children and seeing those correlations, but we still have a long way to go when it comes to making these connections between various different components of trauma that happen in people's bloodlines and how that impacts specifically, in this case, minorities. We've talked about, various different other populations and research studies, but really there's not as much data, at least in my humble opinion, on minority health. First, let's talk about my journey. So for those of you that don't know who I am, my name is Dr. Erica Steele. I am a holistic doctor in family practice. And what makes me a holistic doctor is I have 6 degrees in my field. I have an AS in psychology, a BS in alternative medicine, a BS in natural healthcare sciences, 1 doctorate in natural medicine, 1 doctorate in naturopathy, a master's in public health with a concentration in complementary alternative medicine. I'm trained in genetics and methyl-genetics. I'm certified in functional medicine. I'm certified in integrative medicine, and I'm a current PhD student in applied psychophysiology to study ancestral and how it people in various populations, specifically minority populations. So what is ancestral trauma? So let's talk about that just so we have clarity. It's the residual effects of genocide, slavery, war, forced migrations, colonizations, and other forms of oppression or violence. And it can manifest in so many different ways. Anxiety, depression, anger, substance abuse, relationship issues, physical health issues, and more. And it can also impact an individual's sense of identity as well as their belonging and their ability to form healthy bonds and relationships, as well as navigate their environment. So again, it impacts people in so many different ways. It impacts them physically, mentally, emotionally, relationally. Also, they're not able to really have their own self-identity, the sense of belonging, because they're detached from their ancestral line. And so how this begins to manifest itself into health-related issues. Obviously, there's PTSD, there's complex PTSD, which is PTSD over a longer period of time. Anxiety, depression, disassociation, and substance abuse are just some of the various health issues that are complicit in this particular type of trauma. The role of genetics and epigenetics is this. So, genes kind of load the gun, if you will, and then your epigenetics, which is the environment that we put the genes in, key variants, which are found in, let's say, Parkinson's, dementia, those types of conditions, as well as MAO variants, also create a destabilization within the nervous system, and also THFR variants, which play a role in conditions such as anxiety, depression, etc. And so remember, it's important to understand that your genetics only counts for less than 30%. The rest is environmentally driven, what we put the genes in. And so just because you may have some of these genetic variants, MTHFR is also another genetic variant to be aware of. Even if you have these particular genetic variants, it doesn't mean that you're automatically going to develop some sort of psychosis or some sort of mental health issue. Again, you do have the ultimate power to take radical responsibility with your health and choose how you want to see this whole thing play out. First thing let's talk about is health disparities among minority communities. So while all of that may be true, there are still environmental factors that are affecting minority populations. So, statistics on health disparities in minority communities, higher incidence of metabolic disorders, diabetes, etc., high infant mortality rates for women. The list goes on and on in terms of the statistics around the health disparities. And so why is that? Number one, we have systemic racism, we have systemic oppression that has been passed down generationally, and unfortunately still occurs to this day. I mean, just in the news alone, the headlines say, just to be Black is almost a crime at some level. And so how is it that somebody is supposed to have a positive and healthy self-identity when they're constantly feeling like they have to be on the attack? And so that's going to create a constant fight or flight response. And especially when it's deep rooted within the DNA, that this trauma has not been processed from previous generations. Unfortunately, our generation is kind of stuck with doing the heavy lifting if we so choose. Of course, it's not our responsibility and we can give it back to our bloodline. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But we want to really understand that these health disparities don't just happen out of nowhere. And instead of helping minority populations, it's kind of like we're shamed, whereas other populations have had more support and more of a structure to assist them. Their families have been intact, et cetera. In the minority populations, that unfortunately is not been the case. So how does ancestral trauma play into these roles? A lot of this is unconscious patterns. So again, when you have, let's look at slavery as an example. When you have the husband or the man removed from the equation, and then that's done generationally, right? And then the woman is shouldering the responsibility of everything, of all of the burden, and then her health begins to suffer, metabolic disorders, et cetera. She's doesn't know who she is. She's just trying to survive and trying to be the quote unquote strong one. And then she's choosing partners that exacerbate that paradigm that she's in. So just in that example alone, we can also see that in Native American populations as well, with deep levels of genocide. I mean, with a lot of Native American populations, substance abuse is a huge problem, especially on the reservations and things like that. Not to say that it's not that case in different minority populations, just to kind of give you some examples to be able to see. One of the reasons I became a holistic doctor is because my family line has lots of ancestral trauma. So I'm Native American on both sides of my family, my father's side and my mother's side. My father's side, Scott Irish, and so there's a lot of famines in that bloodline, child labor, also in that bloodline as well. And then my mother's side carries more of the African lineage as well, and so impacts of slavery. And so how that really manifests itself in my particular bloodlines is there was higher incidence of metabolic disorders, diabetes, hypertension, but there was also, obesity, overweight, but there's also incidences of mental health and mental health disorders. So my great-grandmother suffered from, but they didn't really classify it at this time, but we would consider it more of like bipolar or depressive. Definitely substance abuse was there. My grandmother was schizophrenic, and then my mother has multiple personalities and various different other mental health issues. And so I really learned pretty early on the impacts of ancestral trauma, and my family line kind of looking at me going, okay, are you the next ticking time bomb? And so I really chose to take radical responsibility for my health and understand how the interplay of ancestral trauma impacts us as human beings. And so I took my health in my own hands, healing myself, and then I teach other people how to heal themselves as well. Again, we're not a victim to our genes. We can overcome these things regardless of what traumas that we've experienced in the past. The reason that I love holistic medicine so much is because it looks at everything. It doesn't just look at one or two components. It looks at the physical health and well-being of the person. It looks at the environmental, like the relationships. It looks at the mental. It looks at the emotional. It looks at the spiritual components, and as well as the ancestral component. And it looks at the relationship that these things have to each other, because quite frankly, if you don't address any number of these things, the mind is going to sabotage itself continuously. If you do not address all of these things wholeheartedly, the health of the person won't maintain. So we see that with people who, let's say, crash diet, so they'll start off on a good regimen and they'll do really well for a while, and then for whatever reason they slip up, or not able to follow through, and then they're in this endless cycle. And so while I think that ancestral trauma does play a huge role, it's really also mindset. It's really emotional patterns. It's processing through those old emotional wounds. And many of us carry the emotional wounds from our ancestors, and without even really being conscious and aware of it. So I love the depth of holistic medicine. I love the nuance of it. I don't think that there's any other practice of healthcare of its kind that looks at all of the different facets of the human being, from the biochemical to the genetic to the environmental to the lifestyle, even to the energetic side, because of course in Western allopathic medicine they discredit or disregard energy medicine, which has been in the East for over 10,000 years. Some of the different approaches that you may be familiar with are mind-body medicine, so the connection between the mind and the body, like neuroimmunology, the emotional manifestations of disease. There's been a lot of work on that. Acupuncture as well, to move energy, especially to move blocked emotions through the meridian system, to get more chi flowing in the system. Breath work really can help with somatic connection, meaning getting really connected with your body, because we trap these emotions within our bodies. And if we don't address them, they can create disease. So like, for instance, I didn't really sleep well last night, and I woke up with just a lot of grief. I'm missing my partner. And so I'm really able to feel where that is in my stomach. I'm able to honor that. I'm able to love that. And I'm able to validate that, to move it through. So many people are very disconnected with their mental and emotional health. And a lot of us have been taught early on to survive and suppress and not deal with our emotions. And so we want to learn, breath work is a great way to really help us to move through difficult emotions and processing. Nutrition and herbs can be really helpful in the holistic practices when done correctly. So nutrition is not a one-size-fits-all approach. I tend to take more of the macronutrient approach, meaning what your metabolic rate is, which is how many calories you take in, and then your carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. How ancestral wounds and trauma manifest into nutrition is when people tend to have more of a high-fat diet, they tend to, want that soothing and want that comfort, and they use high fat to be able to do that, because all of those hydrogen bonds create a sense of satiety when you eat it. So that is one of the things that we look at when we're healing ancestral trauma, is really getting the diet, because many of us were taught to self-soothe using food. And so that's something to consider. Another component of holistic medicine that we look at as herbal medicine, a lot of our heritage, ancestry. Again, for those of you guys just joining us, I'm three parts Native American, African, as well as Irish, Scottish, and English. And so, especially in my Native and African's ancestry, we used a lot of herbs in our culture. And so I still use a lot of them, although I do use a lot of homeopathy too, because that is more in alignment with my European bloodline. But we're very disconnected with our culture, and that's done through misappropriation. I also call it more of the imperialism of medicine. We are shamed and criticized and judged. I'm often consulted and hired to be like medical oversight for cases, especially culturally, when patients, they have different diverse cultural backgrounds internationally, and they're working with our Western medical system and really to protect their ancestry and their heritage when they're going into the Western medical system, because the Western medical system is largely whitewashed. They don't really recognize herbal medicine. They don't really recognize any indigenous practices. It's more synthetic medication, which genetically speaking, people with any indigenous backgrounds, we can't process toxicity well in the liver. And so because of the MTHFR variants, because of the DHFR variants, and again, in my dissertation and my PhD, I'm hoping to, depending on how it goes, I'm looking to really make that linkage, right? I believe that there's a lot of instability around our nervous system in the genetics of our system because of the trauma. And there has been some research done on this, but not connecting the actual genetic markers, because again, the Genome Project was just concluded several years ago. So there's a lot of instabilities around the nervous system, which in turn creates a lot of different health-related issues. And so we really can't process toxicity at that higher rate as some of our other, let's say, European counterparts. So it's important to understand how these particular things impact us. Energy medicine, like I said, that has been used throughout the world for many, many years. I've worked with shamans in Peru. I've worked with, native healers all over the country. And so I grew up as a practicing Native American. And so we grew up with energy medicine. We grew up, with drumming and hands-on healing. And we grew up with indigenous medicine. I'm very fortunate and grateful to have had that experience. Of course, it was definitely divine calling. And so we really want to get back to our roots if we want to heal a deep-seated ancestral trauma, because continual imperialism and misappropriation is not what's going to help us to gain our self-identity back. Remember, being ripped away and pulled from our land, not being seen, not being heard, not being validated does impact our self-identity. And then we feel shamed because we want to practice more within alignment of our ancestry and our heritage. And again, nothing against the Western medical model, but it just does not see indigenous culture. I didn't really learn different indigenous cultural beliefs other than my own until I got to my master's in public health, in which they discussed how different cultures in different parts of the world actually see healthcare. I believe that every physician should go through that type of training to really have understanding and create cultural sensitivity, instead of labeling people as non-compliant or as resistant, etc. Pumping somebody with a whole bunch of synthetic drugs, especially from indigenous populations, is very dangerous. Okay, so how do you do this practically? How can you create more of a holistic lifestyle? So I'm always teaching people how to do this work and how to live this every day. Again, I'm very blessed that, I grew up in the holistic world. It wasn't called holistic then, of course. It was called, it was just what we do, right? So there's a deep acknowledgement and self-accountability to our world and what it is that we're creating. Of course, there's a lot of heartbreak because there's a lot of awareness of trauma in my family line as well. But we make it a practice by first acknowledging our ancestry. If you don't acknowledge where your people are from, you can't really understand or empathize what your people have gone through, right? So now they do have some genetic testing. Of course, be mindful because some of those bigger testing organizations, they do share your information. So just full disclosure on that. We do have private genetic test kits if people are interested in that. But just to be clear, it's really important that you understand where your people come from to understand where the trauma can potentially be coming from. Again, like, me knowing all of myself and all of my background and being able to trace those lines back and be able to process through this healing with various modalities has been a tremendous benefit of integration, because my family was so shattered and so split because of trauma, that I had to pick up the pieces so that I didn't recreate those same cycles. And unfortunately, if you do not acknowledge what has occurred and process through it appropriately, you will have unconscious patterns and continue to relive or rehearse those same ancestral wounds. That's why people continue to choose unhealthy partners, or they develop autoimmune diseases or various other health conditions, partially because of this unhealed trauma. I find that journaling is incredibly important, mostly because it accesses the subconscious mind, which is hidden from our view, from the world of Carl Jung and the work of him. He talks about, if you allow the unconscious to remain unconscious, it will drive your life and you will call it fate. And so what that means is that if you just allow everything from the past, seen or unseen, just to rent space in your head, so to speak, it will continue to inform your conscious mind, and which in turn informs your decision making. So it's incredibly important to acknowledge your wounds and to be able to process through them. And journaling is a great way to do that, to give yourself space to see and feel and hear and understand. Recognizing too that every day is a fresh start. It's incredibly important to create a structure for yourself, an AM routine and a PM routine. That way you're actually creating your day and you're living your day by design rather than living it by default. So if you start the day with, let's say, 5 things, whether that's meditation, prayer, yoga, whatever it is that works best for you, scripting, journaling, whatever, you're beginning to intend the day, intend how you want the day to go. And then you go throughout the day, and then at the end, you're recapping the day, perhaps, journaling a gratitude list, or just how you saw it during the day. So you're not carrying each day over and over and over again into each, day. So I think that's an important practice, to be able to really find peace and center and security and keep that nervous system healthy, because at the end of the day, trauma does affect the nervous system. So you go into a fight or flight response. So in summary, we'd want to acknowledge our ancestry. My recommendation is to do testing to be able to determine what exactly your ancestry is, and be able to acknowledge and really go to that, the bloodline. Like, you want to see the impact, right? So for me, like I said, I'm Native, I'm 3 parts Native. So I'm Potawatomi, right? The French jumped the border, completely massacred that. I carried a deep level of responsibility because I was one of those people that lived, my family line was. And so I held on to that real guilt and shame, attached to that. Also too, in my African line, my mother also has mixed ancestry. So I'm actually more European, because of, there was a lot of mixing going on, even within her bloodline. And so there was a lot of trauma from genocide, but also a lot of trauma from slavery. And how her bloodline manifested that, again, was through substance abuse and was through dissociation and a lot of mental health. And so if I did not choose this path, I very well would have been, kind of next, did not take this heed of warning of responsibility with managing these things, the instabilities around our nervous system, and unfortunately have developed their own mental health disorders. So we can see the impact as it goes through the bloodline. It doesn't just happen. It's not just like happens overnight. Again, if we do not address what has happened in the past, we cannot move forward. There was a really powerful song that I listened to years ago. I can't remember the artist, but the song was, that this country, meaning the United States, would not heal. And the reason is because it was built off the bones of the natives and the blood of the slaves. And so we have to acknowledge what has occurred in the past. And I'm not saying our European counterparts have not experienced things. Again, like I said, I'm Scot-Irish. So we had a lot of child labor issues. We had a lot of famines. We've had a lot of those things. I can only speak to my bloodline. The English side of me imperialized everybody, which so part of me was imperializing another part of me, which is kind of wild. And so I did a lot of work in various different components. I did a lot of different modalities. I worked with shamans. I worked with native healers. I went to Peru. I travel the world. Like tomorrow I go to Spain and work with people out there. So different parts of the world also have served different places of me to be able to heal because of parts of my culture and parts of my ancestry. So this is something very near and dear to me because, having a mom that goes from this beautiful, vibrant, cancer researcher for NIH, brilliant medical mind, to literally being on the couch overnight and never coming back from a psychotic break. And that happened when I was a little girl. It really got me into thinking about ancestry. Of course, I didn't know that I would, grow on to learn genetics and epigenetics and, do all the things that I do, but it all makes sense now. And so I chose to break the cycle. And so I know each and every one of you that's listening, if you choose to break the cycle, you can too. It is not our responsibility to take on the burdens of our family line and our family lineage, right? However, it is our responsibility not to carry it forward. So there's the thing, I'm a family constellation facilitator, which is a form of psychotherapy and energy work. It was actually developed, it was originally done by the Zulu people in Africa, and it was adapted by Bert Hellinger, a German psychologist who was Jewish. And so he started to get fascinated and start to do this work to heal the ancestral line. And that's really powerful work to be able to heal the ancestral line. When you're healing the ancestral line, you have to deal with it on the spiritual plane in order for it to stick and hold. If you try to just deal with it on the psychological plane, you won't be able to clear it completely. Because imagine that these patterns, are energies, right? They hold on to us. They stay almost stuck to us. And so we are unconsciously kind of living them out. And so releasing those is incredibly important. It takes a while for it to hit the psychological mind, right? And then, of course, there's the nutritional component in keeping those methylation pathways stable, understanding the role of diet, nutrition, understanding the role of feeding yourself, even just mother hunger wounds from not having nurturance or not having support, or even father wounds, all really impact all of this whole paradigm that I'm talking about. But I know for certain that if you choose to start slow and work your way through, I'm confident that you'll be able to break any kind of cycle that you may have, if you so choose again. All right, so now I'm going to open it up for questions and answers. If you guys have any, I'm happy to answer any questions from, a testing side to a, ancestral side, because I've worked with a lot of different backgrounds at this point, to a practical treatment side, to kind of any sort of questions. So if you'll pop them in the chat, I'm streaming on a few different places, and I'll just say the questions out loud as they come in, and then I'll answer them as we go along. And if you don't have any questions, that's totally fine too. I know I went over a lot in a short period of time. Let's see. Hold on. Oh, we have a raised hand. Let me see. Here we go. All right. Hello, my dear. Yes, it's morning here too. Mm-hmm.
We call her La India. And me looking back now of the, the trauma and the ancestral trauma and the physical health, I think everybody, I think either people get physically ill or mentally ill with this ancestral trauma, right? So yes. From my experience, even from my own personal family, I realized that a lot of people use anger as a form of expression, and I've actually had to address this at a family gathering, and also how our health and our the things that we choose, like our foods and how we choose to address them, right? Like you said, that some people are like they don't take responsibility for, hey, we went through this. Like, do you not know what I know? Like, did we grow up in like two different families? Are you like a stranger? So having these conversations is very important. And I tell you that I'm, a 40, I turned 40 this year, and I've had to be the adult to step in for my parents, for my uncles and my aunts and my mother, because I'm like, if you guys are not going to do this, I'm going to do it. I'm going to bring the family together, and I'm going to address these issues, because I don't want the next generation to inherit the traumas that you guys that we inherited from you guys. I want to break the cycle. And how do we break the cycle of actually having a conversation? I lived in Utah, there's a lot of indigenous community. There's a predominantly indigenous community in Utah, Salt Lake City to be exact. And I went to one of their nonprofit organization meetings, and they were explaining that when the man wants to have a conversation with the family, he actually pulls the rug and he opens the rug in the living room. He moves all of the furniture, mind you, back then they didn't have any furniture. But he moves the furniture and he opens the rug. And when he's doing this, everybody knows that it's time to have a conversation. I think that everybody needs a rug. I mean, I'm saying a metaphor, right? But everybody has to have these conversations with their family. And if your parents or uncles and family members that are the older generation that don't have sometimes, and I realize that they don't have the energy, Dr. Steele or Erica?
Yes, either way.
I realized Dr. Steele, right? Dr. Steele, yes. That basically the inability for us to have this conversation is because of our health. That's why I had to I got into health, and I help people understand their blood work, understand how to read their blood work so that they can take control of their own health, because I realized that my aunt and my aunts do not have the health capacity. They're suffering from anxiety, from depression. Like, my aunt gets hysterically anxious when my cousin starts talking to her about the past. Like the lady has like, she's like hyperventilates, like she cannot breathe. And I told my mom, she has health issues that we have to address in order for us to sit and have this conversation. And my mom's like, that's true. And I'm like, so when are we going to do it? Because I can't afford for this stuff to kind of like linger on to the next generation. So that's a conversation I just had with my family. And it's amazing that you're having this room to share, because we need to find solutions of how we.
Oh, I think you cut off. Are you still there? So I'm going to speak a little bit about what you stated. And then if you come back on, I'm more than happy to give you back the mic. Okay, so the first thing you mentioned is about anger. So anger is a protective emotion. So when you've been in survival mode for a long time, right, which the previous generations had to be in survival mode. Okay, so that's not wrong or right. It just is, right? And so they've had to protect themselves for a long time. And so anger is typically an emotion that's used to protect somebody from being vulnerable, to protect their heart space. So that's the first thing. The other thing that I mentioned earlier is it's not our responsibility to heal our family line. It is our responsibility to heal ourselves and then model that behavior for future generations. We cannot take on the burdens of our family line. And I know that may be difficult to hear, but the reason that we can't do that is because it wasn't our responsibility to do that work to begin with. And so if we take on too much responsibility, and in fact, taking on too much responsibility and being parentified is a trauma response. And so we can't be bigger than our parents in the sense, like we can't take on their responsibility and their role, because if we do, it creates an imbalance within the family line. We see this in, again, doing the work in family constellation. The parents still have to remain big in the line. And I know, again, this can be difficult to hear because we want to jump in and do the work, especially for those people that are not doing work. However, again, they will do it. It's just probably when they cross over, not here in the earth plane. Their role was to create what we call polarity. Polarity is for us to be able to see what we don't want, right? So in order to usher into a new consciousness of love, we have to know what suffering is. We have to know what pain is. We have to know what struggle is. So we honor our ancestors for showing us that, while at the same time, we can use that information and that data to be able to transform our own lives and become teachers for future generations. So just a little bit of cleanup there in terms of how we navigate that, because we can't force people to the well. We can't force people to want to heal, unfortunately. And I learned early on in my career, you can't drag dead bodies with you. I know that's a vulgar statement, but, people that are unwilling or unable for whatever reason, mental, emotional, psychosocial, spiritual, to take full responsibility, they will pass on with that. So unfortunately, my mother is one of those. She is not able to see, and she's so mired in her, trauma. And so while I don't have a super deep relationship, I do allow myself to be with her and just honor her and just accept her and just be present with her instead of trying to fix her, change her, make her something different. I don't do that, because that's not what true love is. That's what control is, which is another expression of fear. Again, 5 expressions of fear. control, pride, anger, judgment, and hatred. So when we try to take on other people and wrangle them in, that's actually more of a control situation and less of a healing situation. So thank you for sharing that. Is there anybody else that has any other questions, comments, concerns? I know a few people kind of just popping in. So I'll leave the space open. And thank you, Kirk, for mentioning that. It's beautiful. I'd also like to mention, healing ancestral wounds is a lot of depth. And I've been on this journey and path for a long time. So there's a lot of layers to it. So just to be aware of that. Again, I've used a lot of different modalities. Some of the modalities that I've used are neurofeedback, biofeedback, neurolinguistic programming, clinical hypnotherapy, soul retrieval, Native American ceremonies, genetics and methyl-genetic information, nutrition as well. Let's see, what are some other ones? Various different plant medicines I've used as well. Family constellation therapy is also another modality that I've used a lot. Wounds. And what I would say initially is to really know your ancestry and really get very intimate with it and honor it and love it and accept it. Also in family constellation, they teach us really to connect with the land, connect with our land of origin. And as we connect with our land of origin, that allows us to be able to become more grounded. So in the last few minutes, if there's no other questions, I'm going to walk you guys kind of through a process that we use in family constellation. So wherever you are, if you're working, you can just listen, or if you're able to, you can close your eyes. The 5 fear responses are anger, hatred, control, pride, and judgment. Those are the 5 responses in fear. And that's taken from the Kabbalah. I studied the Kabbalah for many, many years. And that's where I learned that from. I grew up in very conservative Jewish communities and learned a lot through them. So yeah, I have a very eclectic life. Okay, cool. So go ahead, wherever you are, go ahead and just take a few breaths and become grounded and centered and connected and at peace. And go ahead and first visualize your mother and see her behind you to the left. And if you were unaware of your mother, just simply visualize her energy. It doesn't have to be a specific person per se if you're unaware. And then visualize her mother's mother behind her. And then lastly, her mother's mother behind her. And just go ahead and really rest in that matriarchal line there. Feel the nurturance, the beauty, the grace, even if that wasn't your physical experience with them. Really connect with that feminine energy. And then on your right side, go ahead and visualize your father right behind you, right next to your shoulder. And again, if you didn't know this particular person, it's okay. Just visualize his energy. And then build to his father's father. and then again, his father's father. So now you're 3 lines back, mother's side, father's side. So you've got a V behind you, and you've got all these generations supporting you, with you, connected. And allow your mother, your father, just to hold on to your shoulders, each side, and be supported by them. Even if in the physical plane you did not feel supported, you have an opportunity to create that right here and right now. And just breathe into it. And be supported and be at ease. And then in the distance, far behind, visualize the lands that your people have come from. And say to yourself, this is my land. And whether that's one land or many lands, visualize the land as your origin point, as your grounding point, as your centering point. This is your land of origin. Your safety, your security, regardless of what the generations have done. Building yourself confidently, passionately, and securely. Go ahead and take a deep breath. And with a loud sigh, release, and eyes open, wide awake. So that's a simple technique that we use in family constellation to help connect you back. And so it's completely natural and normal if you've had any kind of emotional reactions or physical reactions, or if at times it was a little bit difficult. In family constellation, we bring the missing back. And what that means is when there's trauma or there are genocides or deaths in the family, or even like miscarriages or abortions, things like that, we have to honor those souls and put them back in the line. If we don't, it creates a missing. One of the things that fascinates me is when there's schizophrenia in the line, which there is in my line. Bert Hellinger had hypothesized that came from, like a death, a major death. And sure enough, when I tracked my line, it was as a response to a lot of the genocide of the Native people. And so, it was an incredible discovery that I had in that experience. And so if you're interested in learning about more, again, for those of you who missed it, I have multiple degrees, but I'm currently in my PhD program in applied psychophysiology to study ancestral trauma, specifically connecting our genetics to how it impacts specifically in minority populations with my African as well as Native ancestry. So look out for that as time goes on. Hopefully the dissertation doesn't take 10 years. All right, cool. Does anybody have any questions before we close our room out? Anybody? I know people kind of jumping in and out today. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, I have one more question. In my years of working with people, what is your input and your opinion on our cholesterol markers and how cholesterol affects the way that, and if it's something that even has been considered in your doctorate,
So that's more of a biochemistry question. Now, I have a lot of different training. So cholesterol, there's not necessarily an issue per se with cholesterol. Cholesterol, though, can be a short chain fatty acid issue. It can be a prebiotic issue. It could be a fiber issue. It could be a lipid oxidation issue. So cholesterol in and of itself isn't the issue. It's the triglycerides, the VLDLs, and the other lipofats that are more of the issue when it comes to fat. Now, we can connect that to ancestral trauma, as we were mentioning before. A lot of people that struggle and suffer from unresolved emotional wounds that have impacted from ancestral trauma do eat a higher fat diet. I've seen that specifically in more of the Irish Scot lines, also Hispanic lines too, and African lines. They tend to, and also Native too, they tend to go heavily trained in clinical biochemistry and laboratory diagnostics. And I've been in practice for natural healthcare for over 20 years. So I'm very well known in Clubhouse as well as internationally and nationally. I'm on multiple television stations as well, educating. I just am very passionate about holistic healthcare and getting out there. So so it's actually a liver issue. Your lipid panel is a liver issue. Now, liver also, resentments, anger, lack of forgiveness, etc. On a bioenergetic level, but then on a biochemical level, you want to look at your macronutrients, your proteins, fats, or carbohydrates. You also want to make sure that the gallbladder and liver can keep up with the bile production to emulsify the fats. And you've got to get the fats down to 20% ratio of your metabolic rate, which is how many calories you're taking in. So hopefully that answers your question.
I was referring to the biomarkers on our as the government has marked that if we have the actual numbers on our blood work for cholesterol.
So are you talking about the standard range versus optimal range? Because I look at both.
Right.
I look at both. I'm right. Certified in functional medicine and integrated medicine. So we look at allopathic ranges, which are standard ranges, but we also look at functional ranges, which are the function of the organs.
Right. And the optimal levels for cholesterol.
You're looking for the number?
Well, yes, the actual
no higher than a 200. Probably on the low end, I wouldn't go any lower than like a 170, 179. Actually, low cholesterol is even more deadly than high. Yes, exactly.
Yeah. And that's what I deal with that a lot. And when people come to me about cholesterol, especially women that are hormonal, have, connective tissue deficiencies, I see a lot of that trauma that you're saying, that they hold it in their core. Like, it's just like you cannot get out of it. Once they start getting that cholesterol, and I've seen transformations of like people actually want to give you a hug. Like, and it's that change, like that makes your brain function even. It's the environment of like the whole body. So yeah, I think that if you ever have a room on the lipid panel, I would love to see if we can actually do or host a room on the lipid panel, because that's more of the highest demand that I get is to talk about cholesterol.
Yeah, and that's just because of the what do you call it? The propaganda on statin drugs. So there's a lot more emphasis on cholesterol. Like I mentioned before, the lipid panel is really relative to liver function. So it's how the liver is actually functioning. And cholesterol is not as indicative. If you read I can't remember the guy's work, but the book, The Cholesterol Myth, he goes in depth about the fallacy of cholesterol. It was really done, like I said, to sell statin drugs, which block hydroxymethylglutarate, which blocks CoQ10 and creates a lot of inflammatory process, and it inhibits the body's ability to detoxify. The lipid panel, again, is liver function. So how the liver is processing fats. Now, from a genetic perspective, a lot of people with indigenous ancestry, they have MTHFR variants and have difficulty with phase 1 and phase 2 detoxification, meaning that toxins enter the body and gets encapsulated as fats, and then it enters the liver, and then it processes through that enzyme over into water out the kidneys. Now, because there's a free flow of fats, meaning people are not eating too many fats because of emotional health, because it begins with a mindset and then it goes into emotions and then actions and behaviors and lifestyles. So when people are eating an abundance amount of fat, it slows that process down, that metabolic process, and then creates a process called lipid oxidation. Lipid oxidation is when the fats enter the liver, and then the liver doesn't have enough nutrients to move it from phase 1 to phase 2. So it kicks it into the bloodstream, right? And this is what drives things like anemia, an inflammatory process, and cardiovascular disease. So it's less about one number. One number is important, of course, but it's a combination of numbers and what they all mean together. So we would couple a lipid panel with a CMP14, which is kidney liver function, because that allows us to be able to see how the liver is functioning primarily, and then a secondary, how the kidneys are functioning, because the kidneys assist the liver in detoxification. It's a primary filter. Also, too, the kidneys, just from Eastern medicine, is about fear. And also, too, if people have difficulty digesting their emotions, they're going to have difficulty drinking enough water and going to be a little more on the dehydrated side, which, of course, is going to back things up as well and not move things through the system as adequately. So I think when we take a holistic view of things, we look at all of the different components and not just focus on one marker, because one marker, while it's important, doesn't give us the full picture of what's going on with a person's system. And again, that's why I love holistic medicine so much, because it's the relationship that one thing has to another. So we often focus on mindset first, because that's going to drive emotional health and well-being. Then we have to process through unhealed wounds from the past. And then that's going to impact your actions, behaviors, habits, and then in turn create your lifestyle, because physical health and well-being happens consistently, deliberately over an extended period of time. It's not an instant, especially on the biochemical level, it's not an instant gratification. It takes a lot of time to build and shift biochemical markers in different directions. So let's see. Do you guys have any more questions for me? And I'm happy to do different rooms and things like that. I haven't been on Clubhouse in a while, actually. I was on for years during the COVID days. I had to take a break. It was a lot of work. So yeah, but if you guys have any more questions, definitely check me out on all the social media platforms. I'm live streaming right now on YouTube. I have a YouTube channel that has all the different, things about that. Our website is Holistic Family Practice. I am currently on WTKR and also on Fox channels as well. That's around the country. Let's see, I'm on IG, I'm on the TikTok, I'm on all the things. So I enjoy all the social connections, especially as I travel the world and see different things. So awesome.
I actually wanted to ask you one more question. Sorry.
Yeah, sure.
I'm actually going to be traveling to Colombia. My mom, like I mentioned before, she's indigenous Colombian.
Mm-hmm.
And my mom, since she lives so close to the Amazon, I asked her if we can actually take a trip to the Amazon and see if we can have like some kind of like tour of the Amazon which is predominantly the land there is indigenous.
Mhm.
Can you, I don't know what advice you may have, or since you're like a well-known traveler, this is my first time ever even encountering any like of asking those questions of holistic methods. Like I don't want to be like.
So yeah, I love Colombia, by the way. I love going to Cartagena. I'm like really big into that. So when so do you have a guide? Is that the deal?
Yes, and I want to know the appropriate way of asking like their holistic, methods and
Yeah,
just
so
mannerism and that.
yeah, so I think everybody's vibe is a little bit different, but I would totally go in soft, open, wanting to be led and not wanting to lead. And just allow. They're going to guide you to wherever and whatever you're looking for. That's the one thing. When I flew through Panama, right, and at the time Verizon was giving me some craziness with my phone, and I was so upset. I was like, oh my God, whatever. And then I went to I had hopped over. I was just passing through Panama and went to Peru, and I was working out there. And this little Peruvian lady, oh my God, boy, she took me into this like river and like washed me down and all this kind of stuff. And she goes, and she's like, they smoke cigarettes on you and like throw it in the water. It was like so wild, like all this stuff. I'm just like, whatever. Like she's like bathing me down with stuff, and like I've got stuff all in my hair, and I've got dreads down my butt, so it's kind of wild. And anyway, she's like, don't piss on yourself, and I'm like, sorry, it's my husband's St. Lucian accent, but it was so funny. Like I was not expecting any of that, right? But I remembered she was referencing when I was so angry and pissed off in Panama at the lady, and I couldn't say anything because I didn't want to like be freaking out in the middle of an airport, right? And so I had internalized that, right? And she picked that right up and just she got it. So I wouldn't worry about I would cast out all fear, because they've got you, man. They already know you're coming before you even know you're coming. So you don't have to do anything. They're just going to receive you.
Awesome.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah, let me know. Keep in touch for sure. All right, everybody. Yeah, definitely. I will host other rooms. Just keep a lookout. Thank you guys so much for your support. And here on YouTube as well. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. And yeah, keep in touch. Bye.